Special guest is going to be on the show with us tonight. We are joined by renowned author of Not by Fire, but by Ice, Bob Felix, and he is coming to Portland, Oregon on the 26th day of February. Bob Felix is someone that we've mentioned and referenced several times in last shows, covering the major Earth changes we've seen on our planet. Magnetic North is moving now. This is becoming public knowledge. It's hitting mass consciousness. People are talking about the Earth getting colder. There are many strange things taking place. We saw an earthquake around Mount St. Helens, 4.3, not too long ago, and that was the greatest earthquake there in 30 years. Swarms of earthquakes elsewhere, also a 5.2 off the coast of Oregon. What is taking place on our planet right now certainly involves the sun, and this is an area that Bob has been researching from some time. Let's go a little bit into his bio. He's a former architect, and he became interested in the Ice Age cycle back in 1991. He spent the next 8.5 years full-time researching and writing about the coming Ice Age. He then concentrated on spreading the word. His book, Not by Fire, but by Ice, has achieved international acclaim with readers around the world. Today, Felix continues his research and is more firmly convinced than ever that the next Ice Age could begin any day. In fact, he believes it has already begun. And many of you are already familiar with Bob Felix through Coast to Coast AM, which he's on periodically. Bob, thanks for coming on the show.
We lost it. He's going to call right back.
Okay, we lost him. He's going to call right back. So what we'll do in the meantime is show the graphic for where the location is, where he's going to be speaking. And it is located over at 76th and Northeast Gleason. Bill, we have the graphic for that. 76th and Northeast Gleason is where the Highland Church is. It's not going to be at the Portland Preparedness Center. It's actually going to be in an auditorium that seats over 200. And you can get tickets for free to see this event. You can call the Portland Preparedness Center, 503-252-2525. And I came across Bob's work several years ago. And for a lot of people, it's extreme to mention the idea of a ice age when so many people are talking about global warming. But we are seeing record low temperatures all over the globe, and then we saw the massive snowstorms hit the East Coast and parts of the Midwest, and we're seeing issues with crops failing in all different parts of the world due to these changes. Now we're also reading about other reports about the temperatures shooting up well above 100 degrees, going from negative 30 in some areas to well over 70, which could cause some serious problems involving flooding. But I believe we have Bob back on the line. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm here, Alex.
All right, and can you hear us okay?
Absolutely, perfectly.
All right, well, thank you for coming down, and give us an overview of what you're going to be talking about at the church on Saturday the 26th.
Well, one of the biggest thing I'm going to be talking about is the coming Ice Age, because that's the title essentially of my website, iceagenow.com, and also the title of one of my books, Not by Fire, but by Ice, or generally the title. But we are, I hear all of this talk about global warming, but there's a cycle to ice ages that if the climate modelers would put that cycle into their climate models, they'd be coming up with an entirely different scenario. And this is not something that I've invented. This is a cycle that's been known since at least the 1970s. And so that's what I'm looking at. And a big part of this, and a big part of what I'm talking about, is that glaciers are growing right now in the United States. And I have a feeling that a lot of your viewers are not aware of that. That glaciers are growing right now in Washington State. I mean, for starters, right here. Glaciers are growing on the Nisqually Glacier on Mount Rainier. The Emmons Glacier on Mount Rainier is growing. And a few minutes ago, you mentioned Mount St. Helens. Well, back when Mount St. Helens erupted, there was a great big glacier on Mount St. Helens that melted, and of course all of the mud and debris and glacial melt rushed down the Toutle River, and they had a great flood. Well, you don't hear this very often, but that glacier on Mount St. Helens has come roaring back. It is now bigger than it was back when the mountain erupted. But we're not hearing that, so I'm trying to get that word out. Or take California, for instance, on Mount Shasta. There are 7 glaciers. All 7 of those glaciers are growing. So I'll be talking about that for one of the things.
Could you give us an update on some of the things happening in the news? With the snowstorms, and there was also the report about the temperatures shooting up about 100 degrees, and the possibility of flooding is certainly on many of our minds. Give us an overview of some of the stuff that's just transpired in the last week.
Well, in the last few weeks, certainly, we've been having record snow around the world, record snow in Korea, record snow in the United Kingdom, record snow in Europe, record snow across the United States. So you're absolutely right. Now the Weather Service is warning that this spring could have record floods because of the record snows, especially if the snow melts rapidly. So and when you talk about the 100-degree changes, yes, there's areas of the country that last week were like minus 30 degrees, and then this week they hit a 70 degrees. I mean, a 100-degree change is amazing. That, to me, is another indication of heading into an ice age, because as we headed into at least the previous little ice ages, we know that there were extremes in both directions. For instance, during the little ice age of about in the 1600s, there were areas of the world that had the biggest drought in 500 years. And then later that year, those same areas had the biggest snowstorms in 300 years. So same area, same year. So that's one of the marks of heading into an ice age, is those extremes.
And when that happens, we see issues with the crops, which affect civilization.
Oh, absolutely. That is a big one, because one of the things I say is that even if we're not covered with ice, one of my biggest concerns is that we could be fighting in the streets for food long before we're covered with ice. And I think we're beginning to see that happen. I mean, this is not something I'll be talking about, I guess, next week, but in Egypt, some of the recent uprisings had to do with the high cost of food. I think we're going to be seeing the cost of food shoot way, way higher.
Yeah, and I agree that food storage is very, very important at this time. And also bird navigation. This situation with, well, for example, the different animals popping up, or geese, birds in places where they normally aren't, but also sea life. There's all these shows on TV now on all these strange forms of life that they're finding in the ocean, and I'm sure that's related to this shift as well.
Yes, because that is one of the things that I talk about, is that this is related to magnetic reversals, because magnetic reversals, those also occur in a cycle, and they seem to occur in sync with the ice age cycle. Now, I have heard a lot of scientists say that the last magnetic reversal occurred about 780,000 years ago. But that is way, way off the mark. There was the Gothenburg magnetic reversal of 11,500 years ago. There was the Mono Lake magnetic reversal of 23,000 years ago. There was the Lake Mungo magnetic reversal of 33,500 years ago. And the list goes on and on about every 11,500 years is what I'm seeing. Now, that is not all of them. I can't prove there's been one every 11,500 years, but I see enough of them that recur according to that cycle that I think will eventually prove that cycle. And that cycle, for whatever reason, what I see is as our magnetic field strength declines as we head into a reversal, and by the way, it is declining right now, but as our magnetic field strength declines, I think it somehow holds tectonic forces in check. And so as it declines, we start seeing more and more earthquakes. We start seeing more and more volcanic activity, and that's what we're seeing. So I don't think it's an accident.
Enter the sun, and people are talking about this every day at a level that I've never seen before. And the article I wrote on my 29th birthday, almost exactly 2 years ago, on February 25th, 2009. And it spread viral, and got published in Nexus. And it went viral just simply because we're going to see these patterns and share information about how these things are connected. And now I'm looking at a second report that I want to write on the potential effects of the sun truly on man and looking at these cycles of war. And it's something that's fascinating me because I know that there are people that have studied this, although it may not be aware of by the general population, but they were looking at the sun and its effect on cycles of war, strangeness in the battlefield. A Russian scientist around 1917, it was also the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, was looking at these sunspots in some sort of a telescope or whatever instrument he was using, and then making observations on what these strange behaviors in man. And Bob, I'm seeing strange behaviors in man right now, and we just had the biggest X-class solar flare in 4 years.
Well, I don't know what the solar flare does or doesn't, but I do know, and I mentioned this in Not by Fire but by Ice. But there is a little ice age cycle that seems to go along with the sunspots. The little ice age cycle returns about every 360 years, and again, this is backed by science, but not very many scientists. But there's something called a solar retrograde cycle. So this would kind of fit in with what you're talking about. But about every 180 years, Saturn and Jupiter end up being in the same quadrant of the solar system at the same time. And for whatever reason, they tug on the sun. Their gravitational force tugs on the sun and pulls it out of its regular orbit just by a little bit, because the sun has its own little tiny orbit. But it pulls it out of that just a little tiny bit. And what they have found is that every 180 years, going along with that cycle, is that it gets cooler on Earth. Well, when you double that cycle every 360 years, we seem to enter into a little ice age. And this little ice age cycle correlates with the downfall of the Roman Empire. It correlates with the downfall of the Grecian Empire, of the Sumerian Empire, of the Egyptian Empire a long time ago. So, because with this cycle, you end up having drought, you end up in some areas of the country, of the world, you end up having excess precipitation, and it just messes with the food cycle. And so, yeah, then people start having wars, fighting for food. So, this concerns me.
There's a picture we're going to show. This is from NASA. Graphic number 44. This is a transformer map, the United States, and what you're seeing here, it shows a bunch of red dots, Bill, and it's the transformer graphic. And maybe Alex can find that. But that deals with all of the dots right here, these high risk areas for a grid meltdown. And we see Portland here. We see other major cities. Texas doesn't seem to be as vulnerable as some of the other states. It's going to be very interesting, Bob, because I think I read something today about China having some sort of communication problem as a result of the last solar flare.
I didn't see that, but I do remember, what was it, 1989, when they had a huge solar flare, and it essentially shut down the electric grid in Canada.
Yeah, in Toronto.
And so there's no reason why that couldn't happen again.
The other thing about cycles of war in the sun is in 1859, the Civil War started in the United States. That was also the same year that the grid went down in some parts of the country. What do you know about that particular event?
I don't know anything about that event, but it's interesting is I'm also my wife and I are considering visiting Italy this spring, and we've been watching shows on that, and it turns out that the Italian Revolution, Italy used to be a whole bunch of little tiny principalities and little tiny countries, and they had their battles and pulled all of those areas into one country.